Welcome to Securing Success, where we get to know the professionals that make up the cybersecurity sector. Today, we've got Wayne Lewandowski, the VP of Enterprise Sales at Xage Security with us. I am super excited to have Wayne join me. We've worked together recruiting cybersecurity professionals since about the 2014 timeframe. And over that period of time, we've developed a relationship that's extended beyond business. So Wayne, truly, I'm so happy we get to do this.
Me too, Mark. This is always a good opportunity for us to talk about different things around the industry and, of course, just have a chance to hang out.
Absolutely. You know, there's something fulfilling about these types of relationships, right? Not only have we been successful partnering over the years, but we've gotten to see each other grow and matriculate over time. And when you've been in an industry long enough and you create these types of relationships, it's so interesting, at least from the perspective of a recruiter, to see the diversity in how different careers mature and unfold. And Wayne, really, your career has been particularly interesting to follow. So,
Sure. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about that, right? So
Yeah.
before we get into Xage, give us a snippet on how your career has unfolded and some of the challenges that you've had to overcome to get to this point.
Yeah, no, glad to do that. You know, it's funny. I was talking about this recently with somebody, and he said, when did you decide to get into sales? And I think the answer is when I was very young. As a matter of fact, if you would go back to my high school yearbook and it says aspirations, it says sales. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I just knew I was going to be selling something. So this has always been my thing. I didn't fall upon it because something else didn't work out. I've always wanted to be in sales. And I think for my career, I got into, let's say, some early entry technology at the beginning of my career, way back in the late 80s, and selling beepers of all things. So from there, I progressed into the software industry and became an enterprise sales rep with a couple startups, as well as larger companies like Computer Associates, and then started working for Silicon Valley companies. And I would say early days, probably the biggest challenge, and I know when I worked with young folks that are aspiring to really get into a professional sales career, is building out that discipline. That's probably one of the hardest things, is regardless of the potential either loose or very tight management from sales leadership, depending on what that sales culture is, the end of the day, it's still up to you. You have to wake up with fire in your belly and have the discipline of making the calls, rationalizing the forecast, and progressing deals forward. And that's hard to do, I think, in your 20s and in some cases, even in your 30s, to have that discipline. No, ultimately, it's up to you to make that happen, regardless of the name recognition of the company or their lack thereof. That was something that was pretty clear to me early on, and I feel like over time that became a sharper skill set that resulted in stronger W-2 performance and career options for me. Then the real shift there was at what point did I want to go into leadership? Really felt compelled to take that next strategy because I've always enjoyed developing people, giving people the opportunity to progress in their own career. And the best way professionally was to do that was in a leadership role in sales. And from that point, it was making that pivot not only to frontline revenue responsibilities of a team, but then in the creative aspects that were necessary around really owning a sales theater and developing a strategy, the go-to-market efforts, the resources, the budgets, as well as the staffing and execution. So it's been an exciting several decades for me, and I'm looking forward to the next few years as well with Xage.
You know, you mentioned something really interesting, and that's discipline, Wayne. A lot, especially more junior type sales roles, you may see on a job description, a requirement is self-driven, right? But what does that really mean? And maybe discipline is the better way to do it. But for me, discipline, there needs to be something at the end of the line, right? And you alluded to that as well when you briefly mentioned the W-2 component.
Right.
I don't know I don't want to speak for every salesperson on the planet, but if you aren't motivated by a nice W-2, this probably isn't the profession for you.
Yes,
Yes.
100% agree. And, and I think we both see this being on the front end of recruiting, right? Either you as a recruiter or me as somebody trying to recruit for my team, is you look at folks' backgrounds, and there's a lot of I've built a pipeline and things like that. That's great. That's not the outcome that we get paid for. We have to generate revenue that's a win for our customers as well as a win for the company that we are representing. And that's really important that people stay focused on what the outcome is, because I think that does get lost at times is we don't get participation trophies in sales, and there's no ribbons for second place.
That's correct. And so I'm happy you brought this up because it's a good topic. At the end of the day, if people are exploring sales careers, whatever the case may be, whatever your reasons, once you get that first win, you taste it, I think you can start developing the discipline. And what's probably really important for sales leaders, especially mentoring more junior sales professionals, is that they can shepherd the ones with promise along until they get that taste. And then once it's there, obviously the discipline will follow because they know what they have to do to get to that point.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I see too in backgrounds, the sales career has evolved a bit as well. When I started out, really inside sales teams were just really not a thing. I mean, you just kind of went out there and grabbed the territory. So cold calling process was a little different because more of a physical thing. You weren't really necessarily blowing up the phone as much as windshield time and things like that. What I do like is that a lot of folks start in those SDR and inside sales roles, so they understand the discipline of working a campaign workflow and understand that they have to progress these steps to gain interest and start building top and mid funnel. And then it's, can they learn to then take that process and progress it from mid-cycle to close? But getting that first part of, I have to be consistent. It's doing the basics, that you never lose sight of that, because those skills are always going to be important, even as you get into more senior roles in sales.
That's just basic muscle memory, right? I'd
Yes.
be lying to you. I hire people, recruiters, to do some of the cold calling on my behalf now. I'm grateful that I've gotten to this point, but when we're busy, I pick up the phone and I'm cold calling too. And it's surprising how quickly that muscle memory comes back into play.
There you go. Never lose it, and you never should.
I love it. I love it. So one other thing before we talk about your entry to Xage, Wayne, is that when I said your career was particularly interesting, and I said that I meant it, I do, because one thing I've noticed in this industry, and probably a lot of others, is that when you get really focused on a particular niche in sales, sometimes it's hard to break out. And you started on the public sector side of the business. Now you have somewhat of a different role, and we'll ask you to talk about that. But was that a challenge for you to move away, or maybe not away from public sector, but to add enterprise and commercial sales into your repertoire as well?
Yeah, and I can create a great parallel for the listeners of the podcast too, because I think this is something that it's moving out of verticals, and it's also moving up in your career. And one of the things that I mentored younger sales folks about on this is, I'm in an inside role as an example, and I want to move to an outside role. And this new company is willing to take me on in that elevated role. And what I would say, and this is true, and I'll iterate on this from my own perspective, is that it's always good to start with something that's in the known. You're already going into a role that has new skills that are necessary. You have to develop new responsibilities, but at least you already know the product set. And I think that's important even as you move up or out of verticals as well. I've had a really blessed career in public sector, but I've done it for a really long time, and I just really want to take on the challenge of getting more into a commercial background. And this goes back 5, 6 years ago, because I did have commercial early in my career as well, was to take on responsibilities with the startup I was with at the time, to take on international sales and then ultimately global sales across the organization. And it was a heck of a lot easier because I already knew the use cases. It was just translating from the vertical in the specific domain vernacular of public sector and taking that into specific verticals broadly across the commercial marketplace. But is it challenging? Yes. Is it necessary? No, I don't really think so. I think a lot of that depends on really where do you want to end in your career. For a lot of folks, you could be enormously happy either in a frontline position or maybe a senior role in a specific vertical like public sector. In my case, I just had to scratch that itch and look at the broader role.
Well, that's discipline, it's focus, and it's motivation. So obviously you've got a lot of that going on, Wayne.
Thank you.
Like we alluded to, we've got a relationship, right? You and I have talked on a whole range of different topics. And before you took this role, we talked about some of the options that you had at the time. And I'm really curious on what made you decide on Xage, right? What's this company doing that's unique, and why did the role excite you?
Yeah, and I think it really is a compliment to what Xage is bringing to the market for sure. I mean, I took a 7 month break between my positions, and that's a considerable amount of time, more than I've ever taken in my professional career. And part of that was for just sort of a reset. But I would also tell you that it was really to be very intentional in this next move, because I think the further along you get in your career, the more you know what you really want. And for me, I was looking for staying in the cyberspace because I think it's still an enormous domain that is untapped, and I think the overall potential is huge. And I've really enjoyed the last 10 plus years of being in the data security space, because it's a very literal type of value prop. You can see that if you protect certain assets, the implications of that, either in the commercial market or in the public sector market, is enormously valuable. However, when you look at physical cybersecurity, which is the space that Xage is most known for, this is a completely different value prop in the sense that I think it's something we always talk about in these types of more complex careers. Can you explain to your grandmother what you do? And I think that this is kind of falls into that category. It could be related to the technology that builds the car you drive, the builder that delivers the lumber that made your home, the shirts that we're wearing from the manufacturer perspective, or the supply chain for the coffee shop that you go to, or the oil and gas industry that delivers the gas where you fuel your car. Everything has operational technology associated with it. So the addressable market is enormous. And when you look at the impact of defending all these different facets of critical infrastructure and things that deliver convenience and expectations, like turning on your lights every morning or evening in your home, we can protect that. And to me, that was a really exciting value prop, to know that we had solutions that would deliver specifically into that marketplace.
And what you said, to some people, I get it, but let's clarify a little bit.
Yeah.
Physical cybersecurity. It kind of sounds like it contradicts, right? Because cyber, we're protecting the ones and zeros, for lack of a better term, and physical, obviously the physical. But now everything is connected, right? Everything, just like you mentioned, the gas station, or when we were talking a little bit prior to recording here, we talked a little bit about what was that use case, Wayne?
Propane exchange.
Yeah. Propane tanks. It's like, well, why do propane tanks need to be protected from cybersecurity? Why don't you give us just a brief insight?
Sure.
To really hammer it home.
Yeah, let me start with the two major use cases that are important around cybersecurity. The first one is one that we can all recognize is, guess what COVID did? It proved that we can all work from home and be adults. And it's real hard to impress upon somebody, let's say, a highly valuable skill set that you now have to travel by plane or car to do the thing that you've been doing the last couple of years from home. So what does that mean? If we want that talent as either a contractor or employee, we have to give them that optionality of doing it remotely. However, that might mean that they're going to have access to resources that they don't necessarily need to do their job. So as an example, let's use the oil and gas industry, which is always one that operational technology is akin to, is I might be a contractor for a petroleum company, and I have to work on industrial control that's in the plant or in the oil field, and I have access to certain aspects of that specific gauge, meter, et cetera, but that's it. And I can only take certain actions and then my privilege is revoked. Because the last thing we want is Wayne or Mark, the contractor, that's using their iPad to come in, which is the same one that your young son uses to download malware, now is inside my network at fill in the blank oil company. That's kind of a non-starter.
Yeah.
And it also gives us that capability, much like we're using Zoom for this podcast, is that I can have this ability to participate in a virtual room and collaborate with other individuals that may or may not have the same rights to me to that equipment. So that's that remote secure access type of use case. That other side of that is that because we put permissions that create zero trust, which is very popular on the IT side, think about this from the physical security perspective. If I have zero trust at the actual physical device itself, that means Wayne, the guy that's walking through the plant, can't just access a keyboard and do something malicious to that environment. Because we've determined that trust is based on who you are and where you are and other types of things, the authentication is not valid and I can't disrupt the operation. So that's really important. Now, OT in general, from our perspective, could be anything that's addressable from an IP perspective. And the use case we talked about prior to the recording is we were working with a propane retailer in the Middle East. And we've all probably experienced this at a Home Depot or a Lowe's or 7-Eleven, where you take your empty tank, a little door pops open, you put it in there, another one pops open, and you get your fresh tank. Well, they saw this as a potential entry point into the rest of the corporate network. And so we're securing those propane point of sale devices because, again, it's addressable, it's part of the corporate network, it creates a risk environment for either the person repairing the machine or otherwise hacking that environment.
And anyone, literally anyone, could walk up to this thing, you wouldn't know the difference, and it could be a bad actor that wants to cause some harm.
Absolutely.
Super interesting. So from what I'm hearing, Wayne, it sounds like your total addressable market, the amount of customers that you could potentially prospect to, potentially sell to, is almost unlimited.
It really is. I mean, it's a scary thing, you know, as we started looking at continuing to staff. The company's just been on a rocket ship growth path. I mean, we have closed more business in the first half of this year than we did in the first 5 years of the company's history combined. So we're doing amazing things here. And I think the market, both public sector and commercial, are validating that based on how they're engaging with us strategically to support them. So yeah, I would say really the opportunity of the next 5 years is just really incredible for us.
You know, I'm starting to begin to think that when people say join the rocket ship, it's a little cliche. But
yeah,
what you just said, I mean, it sounds like you're literally on a rocket ship. So
absolutely
fun. And thank you for giving us that insight into Xage, and not just into Xage, but why you joined. It sounds like you potentially made yourself a good decision here. So you took 7 months. You were really particular about what you were looking for, looking to make a good decision. You identify Xage, you interview, you get the job. So I know, Wayne, obviously this isn't your first rodeo, right? But we talked about this. You alluded to it.
Yeah.
Every environment you join is different. Times are different. Selling today is not what selling was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago at this point.
Right.
So how do you go and you plan to be successful here, right? Because the playbook just seems to keep changing over and over again.
It does, and you hit a good point. You look at different increments in selling, let's just say complex solutions in general. And it used to be that it was all about getting in front of the customer, creating awareness that would create that unconscious understanding to a conscious need that has an acute pain. And that was all based on the incredible talents of the sales rep. It's not really the case anymore. I mean, I think it's not going to be often you go to CIO or CISO and you illustrate this just vast solution set and they go, I never thought about this. I want 10 of those. Most of the buyer's journey now is done from a initial interest perspective well before the salesperson even enters the market. So this is, I think, really part of that answer, Mark, is that what we know as sales leaders is, yes, there's always been this sort of relationship between sales and marketing, but now even more than ever, that marketing input to, are we positioning ourselves as thought leaders? Are we positioning ourselves in the right media channels and physical channels from a conference perspective that show that we have use cases and demonstrated value in certain markets with certain types of solutions and differentiation. And then we take that same capability and how do we take that into a sales motion that starts with junior people that candidly don't have the depth of, say, somebody myself or maybe a senior rep that I'm hiring, where they've got that broad understanding of IT or OT. And we give them enough powder in the gun that they can actually have a decent conversation to create interest and secure that next level of engagement with the sales team. So I think that's part of it is you got to look at, okay, what are we doing from a social perspective? What are we doing from a thought leadership perspective? Where are we placing our bets from an event perspective? And then how do we create, most importantly, a use case driven sales approach that starts with how we're showing brand and market, how we take that to an inside sales organization, and then even out to the executives. What is that talk track that flows through all of that, that creates a consistency that really substantiates what we represent? And I'll give you a great example of this, and I've used this in QBRs with teams before in really trying to get a sharp point on this, is Apple. Is when we think about Apple from way back when of the early Macs to the most recent iPhones, one thing that's always the same is no matter who it is, it's simple and it's easy. It might say in a slightly different way, but your 3-year-old can use it and your 80-year-old grandmother can use it because that's Apple. Is it true? It doesn't matter. That's what they are illuminating into the market, and we're going to amplify and project that image. These are the things, when you think of Apple, of all the things that Apple does, that's the most important. And so you have to determine what are those sound bites, what are those key bullets that you want people to walk away with when they forget the 2-hour exchange. What's the 1 to 3 things that, what? That's what those guys do.
So interesting. And you always think, well, I'm going to ramp up when I join a company. Mm-hmm. But in order for you to decide whether you're going to join a company, you kind of have to have a grasp of this before you sign the offer letter. And then at that point, you can start really planning in your head, all right, how am I going to be successful? And how am I going to communicate how I'm going to be successful to the interviewers?
Right.
So that's a really important component. First couple conversations, get to know the company. But then when you're interviewing, make sure that you understand how you're going to present the talk track, especially in a sales or marketing related role, so you can communicate to the people hiring you why you're the person for the job.
Yeah, and I'm sure no surprise to you, and hopefully for a lot of the listeners that's the case as well, is we got to go back to the earlier comments when we started the recording here, is what's the outcome that you're looking for? You want to secure this position, or maybe early in the interview, you want to secure that you are the person that should be considered in the down select. And some of that comes with, how do you illustrate those points? Now, for me, I always like to come with a very strong business plan of how I look at the marketing segmentation, product management, what I look what I look for in healthy pipeline, and when do I start breaking territories based on success and pipeline potential. And so it's looking at that outcome that we want. If we know what we want to do, then we can figure out how we get there. And it's really important to start with that what, and then we can reverse engineering into those things.
Absolutely. That's great insight, both for sales professionals walking into a role, but also from an interview perspective. Develop that leverage and then start asking questions, right? In those first conversations, I'm always counseling candidates across the board, 70-30, roughly. Ask some questions for sure, but generate some of that leverage first. Show them you're the person for the job, and then you can go ask whatever questions you want once you have them bought in.
Absolutely. I think for me, when I look at candidates that are inquisitive and curious, maybe post the initial exchange, and they've done enough homework that they come with a very pointed question, ask me for some more detail, that shows me an engagement level that pretty quickly differentiates them from other candidates. And it's amazing how often people will even miss doing the really basic things, like just a quick recap of the meeting I just had with you as a candidate. All too often, no thank yous, no summary. Again, the product is me, so here's the things I want to make sure you remember. What are those points to the use case of why Wayne versus another candidate, and just reinforcing those points. And a lot of people miss that.
This is great insight, not just for salespeople and sales leaders, but interviewers as well. Thank you. Yeah. Talking about sales leaders in particular, you went and gave some people advice earlier on in this discussion. Mm-hmm. But there are so many people I talk to, sales professionals in particular, that do want to get into a leadership role. And it's hard, right? Because how do you do that? You either typically are going to get a chance from someone you've worked with and has confidence in you, or you have to have that experience. And so what advice do you give, right? There's not just one answer to this for sure, but what general advice would you give to aspiring sales leaders? How can they take certain actions to move up the chain?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is you got to look at what is the motivation of why you want to lead. And you would think that would be obvious, and for some folks it's not. And the one I would say here more often than not is I am X years old and I don't want to be in sales when I'm Y years old. It's not necessarily a good reason. And I think you would know this as well as I do. I meet some enormously talented professional salespeople that will never leave the front lines of being in sales, and they're perfectly fine with that. I've also met many folks that have reached the highest points, SVP of sales, CRO, and now they're carrying a bag, finishing their career because they realized what they didn't want. And so I think part of that is you got to understand why you want to go there. And for me, the things that are most important is you have to change sort of the motivation that you have. Of course, you still want to achieve results. That's going to be important in anything regarding sales. But your motivation has to be ensuring that people that you're serving on your team are successful, and that you're meeting the needs and resources necessary from a skill perspective or assets in the company so that they become successful. And of course, a byproduct of that is your success as well. Sure. If you lose that formula and that value prop, I think you can come into this the wrong way, and your teams will feel that as well. So I think that's really important. There's also two major tiers that you have to think about. Is one is frontline management, where you're really just driving revenue with the team, and maybe there's some development there as well. But as you move up in the organization into a more strategic role, it's not only execution, it's how are we going to shape the market? How are we going to determine the headcount? Looking much more into the data and the operational aspects of the business to determine when do we address that new vertical? When do we reorganize the compensation and the strategy in market? Some folks don't like that, and you have to really be honest about where your strengths are or where you want to develop additional skills. Again, you can be wildly successful just managing sales teams without going into those more strategic aspects of an executive role within sales. So I think you have to really kind of check yourself on which of those things are really important to you and then determine what the path is. But again, I always say if you can get that opportunity within the organization you're working with first, then at least you take out one of those variables of what the heck are we doing here at this company and these new things I got to figure out, right?
Absolutely. So finding your way maybe into a player coach role is a great start. Demonstrating mentorship and leadership to other individuals internally, that's going to help. But most important, and while times have changed, some things remain the same. And that question, what is your why, is so critical. And that's age old, right? I don't know when that came out, but that's always something that's been consistent. You have to be able to answer that for yourself, and realistically, before you go and you make an attempt to sell somebody, that you can do it.
Yes, correct. And if you're really a go-getter and you've been investing in the company, I think any quality leader is going to see that, and they're going to want to give you the opportunity to try things. And this is, I steal this from Richard Branson. He always talks about take the job you're not qualified for and fail forward and fail fast. And I have a slight alteration to that, is that if you can find a manager that you trust and they trust you, fail in a safe place. Meaning, maybe I don't have the management role, but I can take on some of the responsibilities. And then you can have a checkpoint with that leader and say, okay, here's what I did. And they can give you that objective role view on things and say, okay, you know what, Mark, good effort. Here's what we missed. Here's what we need to do to really get to the outcome that we're looking for around these skills that you need to develop to officially be in the capacity of the position you want. So that's also a good way to, kind of test the water, if you will, and go, you know what, if that's 30% of the job, then I don't want 100% of it.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know, and that's critical.
Right. That's right.
So this has been really interesting. Some of the stuff I wanted to ask you about, some of the topics we just went off the grid with because of the nature of the conversation. So
Yeah,
really interesting stuff. I want to make sure I ask you this though, because we're all humans at the end of the day, right? And that's the one thing when we talk to executives and people think about executives, they don't always, I mean, they know they're human, right, Wayne? But you don't get that part of them. You don't see that forward-facing part. And so you've been a really successful sales professional, both on an individual contributor and an executive level. It's obviously a rewarding career, but there's always a price to pay, right?
Yes.
You've got stress, uncertainty, long hours. How do you manage that?
Boy, isn't that the $1 million question? And I would say at different points in my career, not well. I think I've gotten better as I've gotten older, but I think it is important to understand what's really important. And look, our careers are important. It's a big part of probably a lot of our identities and who we are and how we see ourselves, but it should not be one dimensional. And so I think for me, the grounding of family and faith help even those things out, and being able to have that outlook and pressure valve relief around those kind of things is super important. So for me, it's always knowing that. And I've even told people, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, my kids are 30 and 28. Look at the jobs that I had and just think about what age my kids were at that time. You can see when they were in scouts, lacrosse, soccer, etc., because I took jobs that were territories that kept me primarily local. And then you can see as they got older or when they were really young, I was traveling a lot. And that's just a decision I made. But I think that alleviates a lot of the pressures when you decide that you're not going to create conflict between professional and personal goals, and you allow yourself some grace to be able to do those things. Because look, it's all important stuff, but I don't think either one of us would say that if you're extremely polarizing on one end or the other, you're going to be enormously happy. And so you got to find a way to blend that together. Ben, I think it's the the other things that interest your time. So let's, park sort of those important things with family and faith and things like that. But what kind of hobbies do you have? And I know this is one you and I share, is when there's some snow on the mountains, right? That's always a good time. And I have found that habits, and I've talked to a bunch of people in sales because we're problem solvers. And so your idea of downtime tends to be similar, right?
Oh
Is
yeah.
you find a habit, a hobby, if you will, that requires some thinking. And I find skiing and snowboarding are those kind of things, right? You've got obstacles, you have varying conditions, you have the variables of other people on the mountain. So it's something that consumes you completely to do it at a very high level. And so it doesn't leave any room while you're on the mountain to be texting and thinking about that deal, because you could be worrying about going down a double black diamond and not getting yourself in a whole lot of trouble, right? Free sled rides down the mountain in the orange sled, not good,
No,
right?
not ideal. You
Yeah.
know,
So I think that's really important.
one thing, and maybe you intentionally left this out, but I'll tell you, I like some excitement in life, right?
Yeah.
I've taken huge risks in building this business and entering into the recruitment profession. That's a conversation for another day. But I wouldn't say I'm an adrenaline junkie, because I'm not. I tend to approach certain things with caution, but I do like a little bit of risk. And
Yeah.
when you're flying down a mountain on a snowboard or some skis,
That does it.
there's a little bit of inherent danger over there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it doesn't always have to be that way. It could be even having just new experiences. My wife and I travel internationally quite a bit. As a matter of fact, checking off a bucket list item here in September is it's going to be my first opportunity to be in Munich for Oktoberfest.
Oh man,
So
I
how
didn't know
bad can
that.
that be, right?
Oh, it's good. Can I come?
Yeah, that's right. We'll get you a cot for the hotel room.
Yeah. Oh, what a good conversation. Anyone who watches this, truly, especially if they're in a sales related career, is going to benefit. But the most important thing, and this is something I'm going to project every time, is that we're all human beings. We all have motivators. We all have families. We all have things to take care of. We all have goals. And you were really honest with us, Wayne, about a lot of that. So I appreciate
Sure.
how genuine you were in this conversation. And I think other people are going to benefit from it.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it, Mark. Always good to hang out with you.
Well, hopefully you come back to Securing Success. We're going to get Wayne's podcast up there. I'm really excited for everybody to see it. Until next time, Wayne, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Mark.